card came out of my breast pocket at 9:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, under lights so white they made the inside of my eyelids pink. I hadn't put it there. The Varathi scanner arm had reached across the intake table, two-fingered, safe as a watchmaker's tool, and lifted it out while I sat still and let it happen the way the city's emergency broadcast had told everyone to. Sit still and let it happen. Don't resist the assessment process, the broadcast said. The Varathi Collective is conducting a civilizational survey. Cooperation is mandatory and noted in the record. I'd heard it 19 times in the last 4 days, cycling on every channel, so I sat on the hard bench in what used to be the Kelman Street Transit Depot, and I kept my hands flat on my knees and I let the long arm take my card. The depot had been a bus terminal until Thursday. I'd worked it for 11 years, loading coordinator on the overnight freight platform, the man who made sure every crate that left after midnight was weighed, manifested, and stacked right. The company ran 40 route freight through this facility. All of it sorted and loaded by a crew of 8. And for 11 years I'd been the one at the manifest table when the clock said 4:30 a.m. and the first pallets were rolling. Now the Varathi had requisitioned the building for what their announcement on called a population asset survey, Sector 14, and the overhead fluorescents had been replaced with their own white spectrum arrays that ran wall to wall without a shadow and buzzed at a frequency just high enough to give you a headache if you stayed under them long enough, which I had. I'd been sitting on this bench for 2 hours, intake lines stretched from the freight bay all the way to the passenger concourse. 40 people ahead of me when I'd arrived, maybe 30 behind me now, and the line moved at what I estimated was 11 minutes per person, not from any official information, but from watching the assessor's panel lights cycle amber, 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 hold, print, next. 11 minutes per person, 40 people ahead of me, 2 hours and change before my turn. I'd brought nothing to read. I'd thought about it and decided against it because I wanted to watch the process. That's a habit I picked up on the freight platform. You watch the process before you're in it. You stand back while someone else works the manifest and you learn the shape of it. What the assessor reaches for first, fields they enter, in what order, what makes the processing light hesitate. By the time my number was called, I'd seen the same intake run 37 times. I knew the questions. I knew the pause between the asset scan and the readout. I knew that the printed summary card the assessor slid across the table at the end was double-sided and that nobody, not one of the 37 people ahead of me, had turned it over. I filed that away. The assessor across the table was called Vethon. I knew the name because it was printed on a placard at the front edge of the table, in both the Varathi glyph script and in standard block letters, the way a teller's nameplate works. The Varathi, whatever else you wanted to say about them, were meticulous about identifying themselves in any formal transaction. Vethon had 3 eyes, the third one set high in the center of the forehead, pale gold and unblinking, and 4 fingers on each hand, and wore a garment that looked like a gray compression vest, with data ports down the left side. The assessor's voice came through a translation collar as something flat and careful, the way a recorded announcement sounds on a good transit PA system, not unfriendly, not warm, procedural. Asset identifier recovered, Vethon said, turning the card under the scanner. The scanner emitted a soft pulse, 3 ascending tones, and then displayed a readout on the panel that sat between us, angled so we could both see it. I read it upside down, but I'd always been good at that. 11 years of reading manifests across loading tables, the readout said. Object class, laminated polymer transaction medium. Issuer, Municipal Transit Authority Sector 14. Personal identifier code 4417. Account designation, preloaded fare instrument. Current balance, 147 USD. A pause, a second pulse and below it. Asset classification, sub-threshold. Holder tier 7, dependent status, civilizational value assignment, pending supplementary assessment. I looked at that last line for a moment. Pending supplementary assessment. I'd been in the transit system long enough to know what pending meant in bureaucratic language. It meant someone had already made up their mind and was waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Vethon set the card on the table between us. The assessor's center eye moved to me. Please state your primary occupation and weekly resource exchange figure. Loading coordinator, I said. Freight platform, this facility. Until Thursday, yes. Vethon entered that into the data port on the vest. Weekly resource exchange figure. Wage, you mean? The numerical value of labor compensation in the dominant local exchange medium. 100, gross. Closer to 29 after the city takes its share. Another entry, primary residential unit. Apartment. 2-bedroom, 61st block, Harlan District. Ownership status. Lease I rent, entry, vehicles registered to individual, no. Secondary financial instruments, investment holdings, reserve accounts, real property, no, no, no. Vethon looked at the readout. I watched those hands move across the data port with that watchmaker precision, pulling the entries into some larger calculation I couldn't see the shape of yet, only the edges. The processing light on the panel blinked amber, 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 then went still. The survey record shows you as the sole responsible party for 2 juvenile dependents, Vethon said. My daughters, 12 and 9. No co-contributing household member. No. Your sole identified portable financial instrument is this card. The long finger touched the edge of transit card 4 seen. With a current balance of $1.47. That's what it says. The Varathi assessment framework measures civilizational viability in part by the portable liquid assets a population member carries at the time. First contact. It is a standardized metric. The reasoning is that portable assets represent the individual's actual integrated position within the civilization's resource distribution network. Not theoretical earning, which can be overstated, but demonstrated day of liquidity. Vethon looked at me with all 3 eyes now, and the center one was doing something I couldn't fully read. Demonstrated day of liquidity is $1.47. I know what's on the card. This places you in Tier 7, which, in our framework, is designated dependent, meaning a population member whose continued function relies on systemic support structures rather than self-generated resource access. It is not a moral classification. It is a resource mapping classification. All right, do you have any additional assets to declare that would alter this assessment? I thought about that for a moment. The bench was hard against the backs of my thighs. The white lights hummed. 3 rows over. I could hear another assessor running on questions in the same flat translated voice, and a woman answering in a higher register, strained and tired. She was explaining that her home business, sewing, alterations, hadn't generated a cash reserve because she'd reinvested every surplus month in materials and a better machine, and the assessor was logging it as dependent status. Tier 6, because she at least owned the machine. And I could hear in her voice the particular quality of a person who knows an assessment is wrong, but doesn't have the language to say why yet. The whole depot smelled the same way it always had. Concrete and diesel residue, and something metallic from the old freight equipment. And sitting here, under alien lights being told I was a Tier 7. Dependent in a resource mapping framework felt less like something from a science fiction story and more like a particularly exhausting version of a conversation I'd had with a loan officer once. I have a question first, I said. Vethon's center eye held steady. The intake format is structured as assessor questions followed by subject responses. This is not a bilateral exchange. I understand the format. I'm asking anyway. A pause. But the processing light on the panel blinked once. You may proceed. When you say portable liquid assets at the time of first contact, does the assessment framework account for the usage history of the asset or only the current balance? Vethon's hand stopped moving. It was a small stop, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. I'd spent 11 years on a freight platform, reading the body language of workers who were deciding whether to push back on a manifest, discrepancy, or let it go. I knew what a person looked like when a question landed somewhere they hadn't expected. Clarify the question, Vethon said. The card, I said. Card 4417. It's a transit card. It's linked to an account. The account has a transaction history. I'm asking whether your scan pulled only the current balance or the full transaction record. Another pause longer. The initial scan captured current balance as the primary metric. Full transaction records are pulled only if the initial assessment flags an anomaly, requiring supplementary review. Then flag it, I said. Pull the full record. Vethon looked at me. All 3 eyes this time, and I had the sense. I couldn't have told you why, exactly, something in the set of the assessor's shoulders, that this was not how these intakes usually went. I'd been sitting on hard benches for 2 hours watching people ahead of me in line answer the questions, nod at the readout, accept the printed summary card the assessor slid across the table, and walk to the exit. Procedural. Cooperative. Not one of them had pushed back. Not one of them had asked for a supplementary review because not one of them had known there was a supplementary review to ask for. Shh. You are requesting that a full asset history pull on a transit card with a current balance of $1.47, Vethon said. I am. This will extend your intake assessment by a significant margin. I've been here 2 hours already. My daughters are with my neighbor. Fine. A beat. Across the depot, the intake line kept moving. 11 minutes per person, amber light cycling, summary cards sliding across tables, people picking them up and walking out without turning them over. Vethon's center eye blinked. Once, slow, the way you'd blink if you were recalibrating something. And then, the assessor reached across to the scanner and entered a command sequence I couldn't. T follow. The panel's processing light went amber again and stayed there, longer this time. Cheens. While somewhere in whatever system the Varathi had patched into the Municipal Transit Authority's network, something was being pulled and read and organized. I sat with my hands on my knees and waited. That was another thing 11 years on the overnight freight platform teaches you. How to wait without spending yourself. You learn to go quiet inside while the external noise keeps running. The engines, the loaders, the radio chatter, the manifests stacking up. And you hold your position until the moment you're needed. A lot of people can't do that. They fill waiting time with movement, with noise, with anxious small talk. I'd learned to sit inside the wait, the same way you learn to carry a heavy crate. Weight distributed right, back straight, breath coming even. You don't fight the weight. You let it pass through you, and you stay where you are. The panel light shifted from amber to a deeper blue I hadn't seen it do before. Vethon leaned forward and studied the readout, and I watched those watchmaker hands slow down to something I could only call careful. I gave it time. The account associated with card 4419, Vethon finally said, shows a transaction history spanning 6 years, 2 months, and 14 days. 6 years and 4 months, the last couple months, are probably light because of the night shifts. I was driving my own transport for a while before I got back on the depot payroll. Vethon's center eye moved from the panel to me and back. Total recorded boardings, 1,847. Sounds about right. Average boarding frequency, 5.3 days per week. I don't work Sundays. Occasionally Saturdays if there's a big freight move. Preponderance of recorded transactions, 81%, fall between the hours of 4:40 and 5:40 a.m. I'm on the overnight platform. The first run is at 5:05. I'm usually there before it. Vethon was quiet for a moment. The assessor's hands weren't moving now. The account also shows a pattern of balance replenishment. Yes, specifically, the balance has been refilled to between $1.40 and $1.55 on average, every 6.2 days for the entirety of the 6-year record. I keep afloat, I said. Enough for one trip back if something goes sideways during the shift. In case I miss the last company transport, or there's a delay, or one of my girls calls and I need to cut out early and get home on my own time. I don't need more than that. The company covers the round trip for the regular shift. The float is just the emergency money. Vethon was still looking at the panel. You maintain a consistent emergency reserve of approximately $1.47. Give or take, intentionally. Yes. 6 years, 4 months, but yes. The assessor looked up, all 3 eyes on me, and the center one had gone from pale gold to something closer to amber, which I didn't know the meaning of but which looked, in the architecture of that face, like the expression a person makes when they are working very hard to hold something steady while something else inside them tries to move. I want to be certain I understand the nature of this asset, Vethon said. Go ahead. You carry this card at all times. Pocket, since I got it. It is not an investment. It is not a reserve fund in any conventional sense. The balance is maintained at a precise low figure, deliberately. Correct. It represents a single unit of emergency transit excess. The ability to make one additional journey at short notice. That's right. To return to your dependence. I didn't answer that right away. The depot air moved. A door somewhere, a draft off the freight bay, and the white lights hummed, and outside I could hear the city making its sounds, traffic and voices, and the distant note of a Varathi survey drone cycling overhead. My daughters were 6 blocks away with Mrs. Peltier, who had a second-floor apartment and a loud television, and who would have fed them breakfast by now. Yes, I said. Vethon reached across and picked up the card again, not to scan it this time, just held it, turned it over once. The laminate was worn at the corners. The printed identifier, 4417, was faded where my thumb had rubbed it, years of the same small habit, the same reach into the pocket before boarding, the same check. Still there, still loaded. In the Varathi framework, the assessor said slowly, a portable financial instrument is assessed by its current yield value, what it can purchase at the moment of measurement. $1.47 cannot purchase food, cannot purchase shelter, cannot purchase medical intervention. By the framework standard metrics, it is effectively non-functional as a financial asset. I know. The framework does not have a category for an asset that is maintained at sub-threshold value deliberately, as a conditional access mechanism, over a multi-year period, as a function of parental continuity planning. I looked at Vethon. Then maybe the framework needs a new category. The center eye blinked again, and this time it stayed closed for half a second longer than a blink needed to be. When it opened, the color had shifted further into something I would have called orange if I were describing it to someone else. I didn't know the Varathi well enough to know what orange meant. But I'd worked enough freight platforms and intake counters and night shift dispatches to know what someone looked like when they were revising their estimate. I am required, Vethon said, to note that a request for framework reclassification based on data not captured by the primary assessment scan constitutes a Category 2 anomaly. Under the survey protocol, this means the record must be elevated to regional review. How long does that take? The regional assessor for Sector 14 will complete the supplementary file within 48 to 72 hours. And until then, your record remains at Tier 7 pending review. Does that change anything for me practically? Am I restricted in some way? No. Pending review status carries no behavioral restrictions. You are free to move normally within designated survey compliance zones. All right. My hands on my knees and started to stand. One more item, Vethon said. I sat back down. The assessor set the transit card on the table, facing me. I have conducted 112 population assessments since survey operations began in Sector 14 on Thursday. In that time, I have not encountered a citizen who requested a supplementary asset history pull. The standard intake takes 11 minutes. Yours has run 54. I know. I'm sorry for the time. That is not. Vethon paused. I am not expressing frustration. I am noting the anomaly for my own records. The supplementary pull revealed data the primary metric was not designed to capture. This is a protocol gap. I intend to file an internal note about it. Good, I said. You should. The center eye was fully orange now. I will also note the 1,847 recorded transit boardings, all pre-dawn, all consistent, 6 years, 4 months. A wage position that most citizens of comparable economic profile in this sector transition out of within 18 to 24 months due to the physical demands and the hours. I thought about that. The way the depot smelled at 4:30 in the morning, when the freight bay was cold and the loaders were warming up their machines, and the first run was still dark on the schedule board, and you stood at the manifest table with your coffee, going cold beside you, and did the work because the work was there. And because in the payroll office at the freight company, there was a direct deposit schedule, and the direct deposit kept the lights on in a 2-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from this depot, and if the lights stayed on and the rent stayed current, and the refrigerator stayed stocked, then 2 girls grew up with a floor under them. That was the whole calculation. It wasn't complicated. It just required showing up the same way, before dawn, every day that wasn't Sunday. The hours are fine, I said. You get used to them. The Varathi framework, Vethon said, and the assessor's voice had dropped slightly. The flat procedural effect trading. for something I couldn't name precisely, something that had weight in it, was developed across 412 civilizational surveys. It is considered comprehensive. It accounts for approximately 97% of the variance in civilizational viability outcomes. A pause. It measures liquid assets, real property, resource accumulation rate, and systemic dependency ratios. It does not measure what you have described. What have I described? The practice of a population member who, over a multi-year period, while maintains a sub-threshold liquid assets and high systemic load, 2. Dependence, lease residence, no secondary instruments, nonetheless demonstrates uninterrupted occupational engagement, a structured emergency contingency, and an articulated rationale for why the emergency contingency is calibrated to the specific minimum necessary to fill the population member's primary relational obligation. I looked at the card on the table, the worn corners, the faded 4417. I reached over and picked it up and put it back in my breast pocket. You're describing going to work and making sure you can get home, I said. Yes, that's not remarkable. In 412 surveys, Vethan said, we have encountered civilizations that accumulate, civilizations that expand, civilizations that defend, and civilizations that collapse. We have frameworks for all of them. We have not previously encountered a population where the most economically marginal members maintain a calibrated, multi-year, sub-threshold contingency specifically oriented toward return to dependent access. I'm sure other people do it, I said. I'm not special. That is what concerns me, Vethan said. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the drone cycled past again, and the depot's clerestory windows let in the morning light in long white strips across the concrete floor, and somewhere in the building a child started crying and was quickly hushed by someone's low voice, and the regular intake line kept moving. 11 minutes per person, the assessor's flat voice asking the same questions, the amber processing light going through its cycle. The category STI2 anomaly flag, Vethan said, will go to the regional assessor, but I am empowered to issue an interim reclassification note if I determine the primary metric produced a materially inaccurate result. Is that what happened? The primary metric logged you as sub-threshold, Tier 7 dependent status. The supplementary record indicates a 6-year behavioral pattern of what the framework would classify, in its highest civilizational tier, as systemic anchor behavior. A population member whose consistent occupational engagement and contingency maintenance functions as a stabilizing node in the local resource and social network. That's a lot of words for showing up to work. In my experience, Vethan said, the most load-bearing behaviors in any civilization tend to be describable in very simple terms. The frameworks require many words, because the frameworks were built by people who had trouble believing the simple description. I looked at the assessor. The center eye was back to gold now, pale and steady. There was something in Vethan's face that I realized. After a moment, I'd been misreading. That flat procedural expression wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the management of it. The same face you wear when you're standing at the manifest table at 4:30 in the morning, and the numbers don't balance, and you have to find discrepancy before the first run goes out, and you can't afford to panic. Because panic doesn't help the numbers balance. What does interim reclassification change? I asked. Practically, very little. Your daily life proceeds as it has. In the survey record, tier designation would be amended to anchor class, with a notation that the primary asset scan understated civilizational integration by multiple orders of magnitude. Vethan pulled the printed summary card from the intake printer and set it on the table. Then, with those watchmaker hands, the assessor picked up a stylus and made a notation in the Varathi glyph script at the bottom of the card. The notation will reference card 4417 and the 6-year transaction history as the basis for reclassification. I picked up the card. I couldn't read the glyphs, but I could see they were dense. More text than the other summary cards I'd watched people carry out. What does it say? I asked. It says that the initial asset scan produced a result of $1.47. The primary framework classified as sub-threshold, and that supplementary review of the full transaction record revealed that the $1.47 was not the ceiling of the asset's value, but its calibrated floor. The minimum the holder maintained as a condition of function, not an indication of maximum resource access. Vethon paused. It also says that this distinction between a ceiling and a floor is not currently captured by the framework's primary scan protocol, and that this represents a systemic gap requiring review at the collective's methodology level. I folded the card and put it in my pocket alongside the transit card. Thank you, I said. There is one more thing. I waited. The regional assessment for Sector 14 will be reviewed by Senior Assessor Veth Prim in approximately 72 hours. The Category 2 anomaly will be in that file. I cannot predict how Senior Assessor Veth Prim will rule on the reclassification. I can tell you is that the regional file will also include my internal note. What does your internal note say? Vethon considered this for a moment, while in the way the assessor had been considering everything, carefully, as if the words were a manifest, and each one needed to be checked before it got loaded. It says that in the course of 112 population assessments in Sector 14, I encountered one population member who requested a supplementary data pull on a transit card with a balance of $1.47, the assessor said, and that the supplementary pull revealed that the transit card had been boarded 1,847 times over 6 years and 4 months, always before 5:40 a.m., always with the balance refilled to the same narrow range, and that when I asked the population member why, the population member said, "So I can get home," and did not appear to consider this remarkable. The center eye held steady on me. I am recommending, Vethon said, that the methodology team review whether the primary scan protocol should include a longitudinal transaction history pull as a standard element, rather than a supplementary one. The argument in the note is that a civilization's genuine structural integrity may be more accurately indexed by what its members maintain under sustained economic pressure than by what they happen to be carrying on any given day. That's a good argument, I said. I believe so. I stood up. Vethon extended one of those four-fingered hands across the table. I recognized the gesture. The Varathi had sent the cultural exchange material out with the original broadcast, a whole packet of customs, so nobody did something inadvertently rude. This was the formal close of a survey intake. You met the hand, palm to back, contact. I did it. Vethon's hand was cool and dry, the skin with a texture like smooth ceramic. The grip lasted 2 seconds exactly, and then released. You are free to go, the assessor said in that flat translated voice. Then slightly differently, something under the flatness that I recognize the way you recognize a particular tone in a particular kind of silence. I hope the commute home is straightforward. It always is, I said. I walked the length of the depot toward the exit. The intake line still ran. People on benches, assessors across tables, the amber processing light cycling. The clerestory windows were pouring morning light across the floor in white strips. At the far end, where the freight bay doors used to be, the Varathi had installed a passage scanner that cleared departing citizens with a soft 3-tone chime. I walked through it. The tone sounded. I was out in the street. The morning air was cool, and the sky was that particular early blue it gets, after the sun is up but before it's had time to bleach everything out. A Varathi drone tracked in a grid pattern maybe 200 feet overhead, smooth and methodical, the way a good worker makes their rounds. 6 blocks to Mrs. Peltier's. I knew the route, the way I knew the route to the depot, by feel, without thinking about it. The same sequence of intersections and stoops, and the corner, where the bakery exhaust hits you at 5 in the morning, and smells like something that makes you feel, for about 30 seconds, like everything is basically all right. I walked it. 3 blocks from Mrs. Peltier's I passed an intake station that was still processing, a smaller one than the depot, set up in a community center parking lot under temporary canopies. 6 tables running. I slowed down enough to watch for a minute. Same amber processing lights, same summary cards sliding across tables, and at table 3, a woman I recognized from the block, Carmen, who ran the after-school program at the church on 9th. Was halfway through what looked like a difficult intake. Couldn't hear the words, but I could see her body language. Stiff, controlled, the way people hold themselves when they're being told something wrong about themselves. And they're trying to stay polite anyway. The assessor at table 3 was making entries. I stood on the sidewalk and watched Carmen reach into her bag. She put a stack of folded papers on the table. Attendance records from the after-school program. By the look of them, dense with names and dates and check marks. The assessor looked at them, and I watched that long four-fingered hand stop the way Vethon's hand had stopped. That small hesitation. Carmen was pointing at something on the top sheet. The assessor leaned forward. I moved on. There was nothing I could do from the sidewalk, and my daughters were waiting. But I walked the remaining 3 blocks thinking about that stack of papers. All the attendance records. The names of kids who showed up because Carmen showed up. Week after week. The same way I showed up at the freight platform before anyone else. And I thought that the Varathi framework was going to have a harder time with this city than it had planned on. Not because of any single dramatic thing, but because the people it was trying to reduce to a tier designation kept carrying their transaction histories with them everywhere they went. In worn pockets and overstuffed bags, and some of them were starting to put those histories on the table. At Mrs. Peltier's door I knocked twice and she let me in, and my girls were at her kitchen table eating cereal. The older one, Rena, had a book open beside her bowl. The younger one, Danny, was kicking her feet because the chair was a little too high. They looked up. How was it? Rena asked. Bureaucracy, I said. Long line, lot of questions, same as anything. Were they scary? Thought about Vethon. The 3 eyes, the center one going through its color changes. Pale gold to amber to orange and back to gold. The watchmaker hands going still when a question landed somewhere unexpected. Careful voice dropping its procedural flatness for just a moment at the end. No, I said. They were doing their job. Did they measure you? Danny asked. They tried to. What did they say you were? First they said I was Tier 7 dependent. I sat down at Mrs. kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee she slid toward me without asking. Then they looked at the card and changed their mind. Transit card? Yes. Danny looked at my breast pocket. Because of the $1.47? Because of everything the $1.47 means. I drank the coffee. It was hot and slightly too strong. The way Mrs. Peltier's always was, which I had always liked. The card has a history on it. Where I've been, when I went, how I kept the balance. 6 years of going to work before 5 in the morning and keeping just enough on the card to get home if I had to. Rena was quiet for a moment, in that way she had of sitting with information before she responded to it. She was 12 and already had the habit she had not gotten from me. Or maybe she had gotten it from me and I'd never noticed. And that made them change the tier? It made them realize the tier was measuring the wrong thing. I looked at the table, the cereal bowls, and the book, and the kicked feet, and the window, with the morning light coming through it. They were measuring what I had in my pocket. They should have been measuring what I was doing with it. I thanked Mrs. Peltier and walked my girls back to the apartment, made them lunch. Rena did her reading at the kitchen table. Tammy wanted to look at the summary card, which I let her hold for a minute. She was the one who turned it over. Without me saying anything, just the natural instinct of a 9-year-old to see if there was something on the back, and studied the glyphication at the bottom. What does it say? That I live here, that I work, that I've got a card in my pocket with $1.47 on it, and I'm not tier 7. What tier are you? I folded the card and put it away. Anchor class, I said. She thought about that with the focused expression she got when she was adding something to her internal picture of the world. Is that good? It means I'm load-bearing, I said, which is what I always figured. She went back to her game. I sat at the kitchen table and drank a second cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold and watched the morning light come through the apartment window and lay itself across the floor in the same long strips it always did. Outside, the drone made its rounds. Somewhere across the city, Thon was conducting the next intake and the next, running the same questions in the same flat translated voice, and maybe, I didn't know. I had no way to know. The panel light was pausing amber a little longer on some of them, and maybe the supplementary record was being pulled before it was formally requested, because someone had thought to update the protocol. Or maybe not. Maybe the note sat in the regional file and Veth Prim read it and filed it, and it changed nothing immediately. That happened too. Discrepancies got noted, and the manifest kept moving, And the changes came later, slowly, the way all real changes came. Not in the dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of documented anomalies, until the weight of them forced a revision. I'd seen it happen on the freight platform enough times to know the pattern. On the second day after my intake, I went back to work. The depot was back to operating as a depot. The Varathi had moved the assessment station to the second location on Harlan, a bigger facility, and the freight platform was mine again. The pallets were backed up from 4 days of no loading, and I worked a double shift to start clearing. Backlog, 16 hours straight, with a 30-minute break at the midpoint, the way you do when the work is waiting and there's no point in pretending it isn't. The crew was all back. 15, 18, two of the newer loaders, who'd been worried about their intake assessments. Kendrick, who'd been with me for 7 years, had been classified Tier 6 because he owned his car outright, an 11-year-old sedan with a blue book value of $4,200, which the framework counted as a primary asset. He was philosophical about it. Tier 6, he said, starting the first pallet loader of the morning, means I'm one rung above you. They revised mine, I said. He looked over. To what? Anchor class. Kendrick was quiet for a moment, the loader humming between us. What's that mean? Means I'm load-bearing. He laughed, short and genuine. You been load-bearing since I met you. Then? How'd they get there from your broke transit card? Pulled the full transaction history. He thought about that while we stacked the first run. The freight bay was cold in the early morning the way it always was, and the light from the loading dock was that pale industrial yellow that never quite looked like daylight, but that I'd stopped noticing years ago because it was just the light the work happened under. By the time we had the first pallet staged, Kendrick had worked it through, so they figured out the card wasn't just what was on it. Right, they figured out what it was for. Eventually, he was quiet for the rest of the first run, loading with the steady efficiency he'd built over 7 years, until it was as much muscle as thought. Then at the manifest table, he said, "My wife's got one of those cards. Emergency float. She keeps $8 on it because her bus costs more than yours. She should request the supplementary pull if she gets assessed," I said. "Ask for the full transaction record. Don't let them stop at the current balance." He nodded slowly, filed it somewhere internal the way good workers file useful information. Not urgently, not dramatically, just stored where it could be retrieved when it was needed. The morning ran. The pallets moved. The manifests balanced. At the break, I sat in the break room with the old scheduling board behind me. My shift times tacked up in the same handwritten format they'd always been in. Because whoever had rehung the board after the Varathi cleared out had put everything back exactly where it was, and I pulled up the city's public assessment portal on the terminal. I searched my own record first, out of habit. Tier 7 dependent, struck through. Below it, anchor class, civilizational Tier 2 subclassification, continuity maintenance operator, basis for reclassification, longitudinal asset history, account 4417, full transaction record, see attached anomaly note, and below that, smaller text. This record is also being submitted to the collective Civilizational Methodology Review Board as an exemplar for potential protocol amendment. Reference file. Sector 14 Anomaly 01. Sector 14 Anomaly 01. I sat with that for a moment. The break room was quiet. The hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. The distant sound of the loading platform running. Through the window I could see the freight bay. The morning light coming in through the high dock doors. Kendrick moving a pallet with the ease of a man who'd done it so many times the motion had become part of his posture. Sector 14 Anomaly 001. The first flagged anomaly in the entire sector's assessment record, and it was a transit card with $1.47 on it. Not a weapon reveal. Not a military demonstration. Not a council speech or a fleet maneuver, or a species-defining moment of violence or dominance. Just a man who'd asked one question, pull the full record, and a 1.47 balance that turned out to be a floor, not a ceiling, because every morning for 6 years and 4 months, he'd gotten on a bus before 5 in the morning, and every evening, he'd made sure there was enough on the card to get back. I pulled up a few other records, public ones, posted per the Varathi Transparency Protocol, names redacted but sector and tier visible. Sector 14 was running about 40% Tier 7, 30% Tier 6. the rest distributed upward. I looked at the Tier 7 column for a while. 40% of my sector. A lot of people who'd had their cards scanned and the current balance logged, and the processing light gone amber, and the summary card slid across the table and picked up without being turned over. I thought about how many of them had transit cards in their pockets. How many of those cards had transaction histories that looked like mine. Not wealthy, not accumulating, but consistent. Early morning, every morning, same narrow balance maintained, same small reserve for the unscheduled return. I thought about Carmen with her stack of attendance records at table 3. Didn't do anything dramatic with that thought. I finished my break, rinsed my coffee cup, went back to the platform. Work was waiting, and there was no point in pretending it wasn't. But I noted it the way I noted a manifest discrepancy. Clearly, specifically, out embellishment in a place where it could be retrieved later. 48 hours after my intake, the regional assessment came through. I know because the city posted the updated records publicly. Varathi Transparency Protocol, all tier assignments publicly accessible by Citizen ID. I checked mine on my lunch break from the depot break room terminal, standing in front of the old scheduling board. The record showed what I'd already been told it would show. But below the reclassification line, below the subclassification notation, there was an additional line I hadn't expected. Methodology review status active. Estimated review completion, 1421 days. If amendment adopted, protocol revision will apply retroactively to all assessments in current survey cycle. Retroactively. I read that twice. If the methodology board accepted Veth On's note, if they amended the primary scan protocol to include longitudinal transaction history as a standard pull, then every Tier 7 assessment in Sector 14 would be reevaluated, not just mine, all of them, and not just Sector 14. If the amendment was adopted at the collective's methodology level, it would apply to every ongoing survey, every sector, every city running an assessment right now. I stood at the terminal and thought about the number of transit cards in breast pockets across this city, and every city like it, worn at the corners, faded identifier numbers. Balances kept at exactly the minimum necessary for one unscheduled trip back. Not a floor that said, here is the most this person has. A floor that said here is the least this person will allow themselves to carry, because this is what it takes to get home. I went back to the platform. Kendrick was moving the second afternoon pallet run, and the loading dock was full of the sounds it was always full of. The machines, the manifests, the radio, the work. I picked up the next manifest and started reading. First run was at 5:05. I was there before it. 14 days later, the methodology board filed its decision. I found it on the assessment portal in the break room on a Thursday morning. Before my shift started, coffee in hand. The amendment was adopted. Primary Scan Protocol, version 4.7.1. All portable financial instruments with an account-linked history will have full transaction records pulled as a standard first-tier element. Current balance will be recorded as a secondary metric, subordinate to the longitudinal pattern. Reference basis for amendment, Sector 14 Anomaly 001, Transit Card 44 sem scene, balance $40. I read that and drank my coffee. Around me the depot was warming up. The loaders starting, the manifest printer running, the freight platform coming online for the day. Clara's story windows were letting in the early light, the same white strips across the concrete floor that had been there for 30 years. My hand to my breast pocket, felt the card, still there, still loaded. That was the whole thing, start to finish. A scan that missed its measurement. A question about what the scan had pulled. A 6-year record that the scan hadn't been built to read. An assessor who wrote the anomaly down, precisely, and filed it, where someone with authority could find it. And then the framework changed. Not because of a war. Not because of a display of force, or a revelation of hidden capability, or a moment of species-defining drama. Because one card's transaction history didn't match its current balance. And someone on both sides of the table had been thorough enough to notice. The coffee cup down and went to the platform. The work was waiting. It always is. 3 days after the regional assessment posted, I had a second visitor. I was on the freight platform, mid-morning, working through a consignment dispute, a crate of industrial components that had Been logged at the origin depot as 847 kilograms and arrived at 891, which was the kind of discrepancy that sounded small until you multiplied it across 40 routes and understood what it meant for the weight ratings on the transport seals. I had the manifest spread on the table and Kendrick on one side and the transport operator on the other, and we were working through it the way you work through a number problem. Methodically, without heat, starting from what the paper said and working backward to where the paper got it wrong. A Varathi came through the freight bay doors, not a standard setter. This one wore a different garment, the same gray compression material but with a double band of pale yellow across the shoulder, and the data ports ran down both sides of the vest instead of just the left. 3 eyes, same configuration. This one had a marking on the forehead I hadn't seen on Veth-On. A thin horizontal line in what looked like the same material as the vest, integrated into the skin or the surface of it. Somehow, that ran above the center eye, like the number notation on a transit schedule board. Senior designation, I guessed, or something equivalent. Behind the senior assessor came 2 standard assessors, both carrying portable scanner units. DeMarco Thill, the senior assessor, said. Loading coordinator Kelman Depot, that's me. I am Veth Prim, regional assessor Sector 14. I understand you are familiar with that name. From the file notation, yes. Kendrick looked at me. I gave him a slight nod. The one that means handle the manifest. I'll be a minute. And he turned back to the transport operator and the consignment. Dispute without a word. That was the thing about Kendrick. He understood the economy of the moment. Some things you talk about later, and some things you just let run. I stepped away from the table. I normally conduct regional reviews remotely, Prim said. The Category 2 anomaly in your file prompted me to conduct this one in person. All right. I have read Assessor Veth-On's intake record and internal note in full. I have also pulled the complete account history for Transit Card 44 seen directly from the Municipal Transit Authority's primary database, independent of the initial scan. The center eye regarded me steadily. I have a number of questions. I answered questions for 54 minutes on Tuesday. These are different questions. Veth Prim looked around the freight platform. The pallets, the loaders, the overhead dock lights, the manifest table, where Kendrick was now running numbers on the disputed crate with a quiet efficiency of someone who'd been doing math this way. 7 years. The standard format is a table in an assessment facility. I am choosing a different format. I would like to see where you work. That was unexpected. I thought about it for a moment. Not whether to agree, I was going to agree, but what the request meant. Veth Prim wanted to see the platform. Because the platform was in the transaction record. Was the reason for the transaction record, was the place the card got loaded, and the balance got maintained, and the 4:30 a.m. shift started. The senior assessor wanted to map the abstract data to the physical thing it described. That was careful work. I respected it. The tour isn't long, I said. There isn't much to see. That is often the most informative kind of facility, Veth Prim said. I showed the regional assessor the platform. The manifest table first. The worn edge where years of leaning had rounded the laminate, the stacked folders of that week's freight runs, the coffee ring from my cup that morning that I'd meant to wipe off and hadn't yet, then the bay itself, the loading equipment, the pallet stations, the weight scales that I recalibrated every Monday morning, because a scale that's slightly off compounds errors across the week. The freight entry, where the incoming trucks reversed to the dock at 4:15 and I was usually there to meet them. Veth Prim walked the platform slowly, the 2 standard assessors trailing, scanning nothing, just observing. The center eye moved across everything with that steady methodical focus, and occasionally one of the 4 fingered hands would point at something. The recalibration log on the scale, the layered wear marks on the dock bumpers, the notation system I used on the manifests, a shorthand I'd developed over the years so a second set of eyes check could run at a glance. At the manifest table, Veth Prim stopped. You have notation for a weight discrepancy here, the assessor said, pointing to the open consignment file. That's a current one. In process. Origin weight logged as 847. Arrival weight 891. 44 kilogram variance. I'm tracking it back through the origin paperwork. Veth Prim looked at the file for a moment. Your notation distinguishes between weighing equipment calibration error, loading sequence shift, and manifest transcription error as three possible causes. You have checked two of them off. Equipment calibration at origin, their scale shows a consistent high drift pattern going back 6 weeks. So I flagged the likely cause first. Second check was transcription, which I ruled out because the origin and the manifest match exactly. So it's the sequence shift. Crate was restacked after the initial weigh. You determine this without physically inspecting the crate. The paper told me, if you know what you're looking for. Vethprim was quiet for a moment, then, in the Varathi framework, procedural competence of this kind, systematic error tracing, maintenance of calibration logs, developed personal notation systems for rapid quality check, is classified under what we call operational continuity architecture. It is a marker associated with Tier 2 and above. You don't say, it does not appear in the primary asset scan. No, I said, it wouldn't. Center Eye held on me. Assessor Vethon's note argued that the primary scan's failure to capture longitudinal transaction history was the critical protocol gap. Having seen this platform, I believe the gap is wider than that. The transaction history of card 44-7 is one data point. This facility, your management of it over 11 years, the calibration logs, the notation system, the error tracing methodology, is a different class of data entirely, and it is also invisible to the primary scan. The scan looks for assets, he said. This platform isn't an asset, it's a practice. Vethprim repeated that slowly. A practice. I don't own this platform, it's not mine. The company owns it. I'm the labor. But the 11 years of doing the work a certain way, that goes with me when I walk out. That's mine. The regional assessor looked at the manifest table for a long moment. At the coffee ring, and the worn edge, and the shorthand notation, and the open assignment file with its 3-branch error trace. Then Vethprim turned to one of the two standard assessors and said something in the Varathi language which I couldn't follow, and the standard assessor made a long entry on a portable datapad. I am adding a supplementary field note to your regional file, Vethprim said, turning back to me. It will reference the platform assessment in addition to the transaction history anomaly. The methodology review will receive both. All right. I also want you to understand the scope of what you've triggered, Vethprim said. The Category 2 anomaly from your intake is currently one of 43 flagged anomalies from the Sector 14 survey. 31 of them involve portable financial instruments, transit cards, prepaid utilities, emergency transport vouchers, where the current balance is sub-threshold, but the account history shows a longitudinal maintenance pattern. Assessor Vethon's note was filed Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 other assessors in Sector 14 had begun running supplementary transaction pulls as a default step, without being instructed to. I looked at the assessor. Word gets around in a department. Apparently so. The Center Eye was doing something I now recognized as the amber precursor. Not yet orange, but moving. The methodology review is now examining not one anomaly, but a pattern. 43 records. The argument for protocol amendment has shifted from a single interesting case to a systemic measurement gap. That's a stronger argument, I said. Yes. Vethprim paused. The amendment, if adopted, will affect every active survey site. We currently have surveys running in 14 cities. I thought about that number. 14 cities. Each one with its own intake lines, its own processing lights cycling amber, its own stack of summary cards being picked up and carried out without being turned over. Its own people with worn transit cards in breast pockets, balances kept at the precise minimum necessary for one unscheduled return. When does the board decide? I asked. In approximately 10 days. Field note from this visit will be included in the submission. Vethprim looked at the platform one more time, the full sweep of it, dock to manifest table to freight entry, and then at me. One more question. Go ahead. When you requested the supplementary pull on Tuesday, you had watched 37 intakes from the waiting bench before yours. Yes, you knew the format. You knew what the assessors were and were not scanning. I paid attention, yes. Did you anticipate that the transaction history would change the outcome? I considered the question the way I considered a manifest, starting from what was actually on the paper. Not what I wished was on it, not what I assumed, but what the numbers actually said. I knew the history was there, I said. I knew it told a different story than the balance. I didn't know if your framework had a category for that story. I asked for the pull because it was the accurate data, and I thought accurate data should be on the record regardless of what you did with it. Veth Prim held still for a moment, all three eyes. That, the regional assessor said carefully, is also not currently a metric in the primary scan. What isn't? The disposition of a population member toward accurate record keeping. Even when an inaccurate record would not disadvantage them further. You were already classified Tier 7. Requesting the pull did not improve your immediate situation. You asked for it because it was correct. I shrugged. A manifest that's wrong is wrong whether it helps you or hurts you. Doesn't matter if you're the one taking the loss. No, Veth Prim said. I suppose it doesn't. The regional assessor and the two standard assessors left the way they'd come. Through the freight bay, back out to the street. I watched them go, and then went back to the consignment dispute, which Kendrick had nearly resolved in my absence. The last two entries on the origin scale drift log completing the paper trail. The number balanced. The manifest was right. We moved on to the next one. I didn't tell anyone about the visit. There was nothing to tell, really. That wasn't already in the public record, and the work was waiting, and there was no point in pretending it wasn't. Kendrick asked about it later, at the afternoon break, and I told him what Veth Prim had said about the 43 anomaly assessors, who'd started pulling transaction histories, without being told to. He thought about that for a while, turning his coffee cup in his hands. So Vethon filed the note and it just spread. Apparently, because the other assessors read it and thought, yes, that's a gap, that's what it sounds like. He nodded. That's how it works when someone documents a thing right. Doesn't need a campaign. Just needs to be clear and specific, and in the file where the right people can find it. That was Kendrick. 7 years working manifests. He understood documentation the way some people understand music. Not as a procedure, but as a practice with its own internal logic, its own rhythm, its own way of making the invisible visible. You should tell your wife, I said, about the supplementary pull, about asking for the full transaction history. He already had. She'd called the assessment center that morning and requested a review. Transit card had 11 years of pre-dawn boardings on it. The hospital where she worked started her shift at 6, which meant she'd been on the 5:10 bus every workday. For 11 years, the balance kept at $8, because her route cost more than mine. The assessor on the phone, after a pause that sounded like the pause I'd seen in Vethon, had said, "We'll flag that for supplementary review." Good. Yeah, he said. Good. The days ran. The freight moved. The methodology board convened and deliberated, and on the 14th day filed its decision, which I read on the break room terminal on a Thursday morning, with my coffee going slightly cold beside me. Amendment adopted. Protocol version 4.7.1. All portable financial instruments with account-linked histories. Full transaction records as a standard first-tier pull. Current balance as secondary metric. Retroactive review of all current cycle Tier 7 assessments to begin within 30 days. Reference basis. Sector 14 Anomaly 001. I read that and finished my coffee. Around me the depot was running at full pace, the way it always did at the start of a shift. The loaders, the manifests, the radio, particular percussion of a freight platform in motion that I'd heard so many thousands of times it had become part of the silence. Transit card 44-7, balance in 47s. Not a weapon, not a warship, not a council speech or a fleet maneuver. Not a hidden military capability revealed in a moment of dramatic necessity. Just a worn card in a breast pocket, a $1. 47 floor maintained for 6 years and 4 months, and the decision to ask one question. Did you pull the full record, or just the balance? And then, after that, a note, filed precisely, in the right archive, by someone who knew that the difference between a ceiling and a floor was worth documenting. I put the coffee cup down and went to the platform. The work was waiting.